Last week, we delved into understanding artificial intelligence, and now we're continuing our series with a discussion on the ethics surrounding the technology. Ashley Julier sat down with Needham resident and Olin professor Erhard Gref to learn about the concerns people in and outside of the tech industry have.
What are some of the, ethical quandaries that artificial intelligence may create or is currently creating right now?
There are so many. There's a lot of concern about this idea of artificial general intelligence. And you'll see this in the news a lot, where folks are worried about AI kind of running amok, right? Like they'll have this idea that we're very close to having an artificial intelligence that is able to make its own decisions, to have a good bit of autonomy, and then through its programming, it'll be making some set of moral decisions, like human beings would. And so there's concern that, well, if they're going to be making those decisions, what kind of protections do we have in place to ensure that these kind of AI bots and robots, et cetera, aren't running amok, aren't harming humans because they are choosing to do so, right? So there's that big kind of class of concerns there. But I think that there's a lot more immediate concerns that we need to worry about. Artificial intelligence is already transforming the economy, right? It's being used to evaluate people for hiring. It's replacing people's jobs in certain cases, or it's being used by certain workers in ways that are transforming their jobs and possibly transforming them out of a job. So we need to think about those economic safeguards because on the one hand, we're thinking about what innovation offers as promises for society, for economic benefits, creating new jobs. I think those do exist. But at the same time, there's a lot of concern about the ways it's going to be replacing a lot of workers. So there's the economic concerns. There's also issues of inequality. So when you take any machine learning approach, it's learning based on some data set, right? And that data set is something that already exists. And so a lot of that data are things that have already been out there in the world, media, texts, et cetera. And so those have encoded a certain set of biases that the world already observes within its status quo. Systems are already organized around, racial discrimination, class-based discrimination. And so we're worried that those things are going to be baked into these artificial intelligence tools. We see this played out in really negative ways around facial recognition technology. Right, so this is a class of machine learning tools that's trying to detect people's faces, trying to, say, here's a picture of someone or video capture, and saying this is who this is based on looking at a number of images that we have in some, data set we've looked through. Unfortunately, that's trained on a set of algorithms and tools and photographs that are actually always had problems detecting differences in darker skinned faces. Right? And so it's leading to false positives around folks who are Black, who have darker skin. And so there's been widespread concern about this in a number of different communities, such that they've even taken on the role of, at a municipal level or at a state level, saying we're banning the use of these technologies for policing and surveillance because we can't trust them.
Are there any plans to have some sort of check and balance for these tech companies or a way to kind of prevent these biases from being ingrained in the technology?
So there's been a number of kind of AI ethics principles that have been developed by academics, by consortia of companies who are kind of the big tech players in this space, as well as different advocates, nonprofits, et cetera, who are concerned about different aspects of this. Those are all meant to say, here are things that we think you should be following as guidelines. Now, they're not legally binding, right? Even when a company says, well, we have these ethical principles, right, that guide our work when we're designing a tool, when we think about how we're going to implement it. But largely it's about self-policing. It's about saying internally, this is what we think we should be doing. These are kind of the design principles we're taking into account as we move forward with the things that we're building. A stronger approach would be to say, there should be some legally binding set of regulations. The EU has already adopted legislation around this that's currently going through kind of final revisions and implementation. And so they're taking a very strict approach of saying, we actually think that there are these rights that need to be preserved in any case where AI is being used around a hiring decision, or in a case of using someone's data, is it preserving their data privacy? EU for many years has been ahead of the United States and other countries on creating legislation to preserve privacy of its citizens around data and information that's used. So that's another approach. The US is a little further behind on that. The White House has been doing a really good job of being proactive and engaging with tech leaders and putting forward proposals of kind of a stricter set of AI principles. Just recently, the White House announced that several tech leaders had adopted, through a closed door deliberation, a set of principles by which they would be organizing their kind of AI design work. And so this was seen as a win that kind of, there was some conversation between, an elected government or representatives of an elected government and these technology companies, but it's still not legally binding, right? It's still in this kind of space of principles. And so we're hopeful that folks will be, folks who are designing these technologies will be thinking carefully at every stage of how they're introducing this work. But you'll see that a lot of folks are worried that that's not enough. And so earlier this summer, we saw an open letter published by a number of kind of well-known advocates, academics, tech leaders, even Elon Musk was among them, that was saying, actually, we need to pause all AI development, in the style of ChatGPT or these other large language models and tools that are being used to kind of use AI in a lot of kind of creative ways, and say, stop doing that. We really need to have a conversation about whether this is good or not. What are the use cases that we think are allowable? What do we think are the best ways that we can protect human life in the future as we try and develop these tools going forward? And so that was an interesting moment where there was a lot of folks, it's got a lot of signatures on this open letter saying, we're at a point where we need to talk as a society about what we think is important here and what we value before we move forward on developing these AI tools more. And I think that that's a good step, an important step, because my interest is in where do we as a democratic society kind of have a role to play in the ways technologies are designed and used. And for me, it's all about that question of agency. And that's the big question, the big ethical question when it comes to AI. Because AI is about taking over some of that agency, right? It making some of those decisions. It's doing that optimization work. It's making decisions, as opposed to, humans. All right, or a democratic society that is supposed to deliberate, over its kind of fraught tensions between different values that, it should be holding as priorities. And so we need to have that larger conversation as a society.
What are some of the first steps, do you think, that as a society we should take to have that conversation?
We're realizing in this moment that technology is having these great impacts on society, right? And we need to be having that conversation as a society about what we think is important. And so we should be having those at the local level, right? We should be doing work to inform ourselves about how these technologies actually work, and thinking about what kind of say we should have over them. What should a municipality like Needham be thinking about on these things? As I said, we've seen municipalities make decisions about the use of facial recognition technology, right, for surveillance or police work. And we need to be thinking about what kind of a say we want in that. How are we guaranteeing human rights, civil rights, the things that we expect the government to be guaranteeing for all of us. And so I think that that's really important. And so we should be talking to our legislators about that. Are you paying attention to these issues, right? Do you have opinions on it? How are you educating yourself? Are you trying to bring in experts to learn more about these things and inform your policymaking? I think that's going to be necessary. We can't leave it to companies to police themselves on this stuff because it has such dramatic implications for society. right, and for human rights. And so because that is such an open and important conversation, it probably needs to be happening at an earlier stage too. It needs to be in high schools. We need to be having these conversations early on so that everyone is thinking about this, has a certain level of comfort and familiarity with these topics, and maybe a little bit about how these technologies work, such that they can be asking these hard questions, right? And feeling that they can be on a journey of being informed as a citizen, and being part of the group of stakeholders that we all are in what is going on with technology in society.
So it's almost like up there with, I feel like there's been greater conversations about inclusion and like actually having those difficult conversations about race or gender identity. And so now we kind of have to also talk about technology. Like, you think it's like right up there and important to discuss?
I don't think it's not just important in set of those priorities, but it interacts with all those other issues we care about. If you're somebody who cares about racial inequality, who cares about gender discrimination, right, you need to be caring about computing and artificial intelligence, because all of those things are being used in ways that are affecting kind of how that inequality plays out, right? And so being familiar with those things, being advocates for either a pause on that technology or regulation and other approaches to understanding the ethics, or pushing forward a kind of moral agenda around what we as a society expect companies and artificial intelligence to be doing and to be accountable for. We all need to be a part of that conversation.
All right. Is there anything else you think Needham residents should know?
You might not be experiencing this AI on a daily basis, but there's a lot of ways that it's subtle, that it's being built into every car that you might want to buy or that you drive, that it's being built into the search engines that you look for information online, that every time you log into your phone, all of those bits of information are being used to train artificial intelligence kind of out there in the world somewhere. And so you're part of this situation, you're part of this issue, whether you realize it or not. Everything that you, like whenever you write an email, like, if you're in Gmail and Google's using all of that text in order to train its artificial intelligence. And so that's just to say that don't think it's somebody else's problem, right? That this is something that you do have a stake in. And so that you should be paying attention to the news stories around this, should be paying attention to what your legislators are talking about when it comes to these issues, or if they're not talking about it, try and figure out why that is, and maybe that's an opportunity for a phone call or an email. And think about what does this mean as a kind of responsibility you might have in the community to kind of help young people understand the ways that computing is transforming their lives, is transforming society. It's an exciting time because all of this innovation is leading to new opportunities and leading to new kind of ways that make lives easier, to medical advances that will make us healthier. So all of that are really exciting opportunities that come with machine learning and artificial intelligence. And we just need to be thinking about, okay, let's also minimize the harms that come from this. Let's think about how we can be part of a way that we're preserving democracy, that's preserving human rights. Are there ways that these tools, that these technologies can actually be narrowing some of these gaps in inequality as opposed to widening them? That's what we should be aiming for. And so let's all be part of that conversation.